Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Cameron Kroetsch. Once again, I think this is the third time you've been on the podcast. Thank you very much for coming back to talk about downtown Hamilton and kind of just been a punching bag for right-wing talking points for the last, I don't know, last few months. So Cameron, thank you for coming back on and we can talk about what's actually happening in downtown Hamilton these days. Thank you very much.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Initially, when we wanted to have you on, we wanted to talk about. Initially, there was talk about the tax courts saying they can no longer hold court anymore because it's too violent in the downtown. Gun violence was erupting, and made it sound like it was like this open Mad Max, shoot 'em up, OK Corral downtown. That it was too unsafe for the workers to do their job. And then we've had the news that Doug Ford is going to close down the safe consumption sites that is in the Hamilton Urban Core Community Health Center. That'll be shut down along with the satellite service at St. James Presbyterian Church. And most recently, we've had LiUNA President Joe Mancinelli go on Facebook to say that they're trucking in by the busloads homeless people to set up tent encampments in downtown, and how dare they, and all this. And I want to hear your take on this as a councillor for a downtown ward on Hamilton City Council. You're in the thick of it. You're on the ground. Tell us your thoughts on this. Like what like is what's going on in downtown Hamilton from your viewpoint?
Yeah, and I'd be happy to speak to those issues you raised, but I think what we're experiencing in downtown Hamilton is what I think is happening in many other large cities. We're seeing that housing affordability is having a trickle-down effect, to use that phrase. It's having an impact, and there are people who are no longer able to afford to live in our city. There are people who, first of all, weren't ever able to afford to live in our city, but because of ODSP rates and other kinds of things, and Hamilton having a disproportionate number of folks with disabilities who live here, we see a lot of people who are forced to live in shelters. Those shelter arrangements don't always work out. Folks who are forced to live on the streets, and people are suffering and they're struggling. And a lot of what's led to that has been the rapid commodification of real estate and housing and other kinds of things, right? So where Hamilton was a very affordable place to live before, where largely because there were enough vacant properties around that folks who were deprived of housing could live behind without being challenged to move along, as people like to say.
Well, I remember
You know,
back, it wasn't too long ago. Now it feels like a lifetime ago, but the big news was how Hamilton was the site of all these young urban professionals. The idea was like these young chefs. I remember it was the story coming out of Toronto because they couldn't afford the rent in Toronto, and they're coming to Hamilton to set up shop because Hamilton was kind of welcoming and just, yeah, come on in. We'll find you a spot, set up a spot, do your thing, and make Hamilton great. And it was, for a while, it was kind of this, urban utopia of just kind of fresh ideas, cheap rent, and what have you. Uh, I don't know if that's the case anymore. I don't. I think you're right, exactly as you pointed out. The problem has kind of metastasized.
it's certainly not the case anymore. The affordability crisis is really obvious here. And where people may have had places to go before, they don't anymore. And what's happening is now the commodification of private space has made public space an extremely important idea. Green space, especially, is really important to people. And what we're seeing is that there's a competition now for those who are deprived of housing to have somewhere to be, because they have to be allowed to be somewhere. There's not room for them inside. We can't tell them they can't exist outside. And so there's a competition there. And of course, from people who want to access the same amenities that are for the public. And so that tension is happening. And we're seeing a lack of services available to support people who use drugs. And what that's doing is forcing people again out into public spaces to use drugs. And again, that's creating tension between people who don't want to use those spaces for that and those who have no choice but to use those spaces for that. So that's part of what's happening, I think, largely. Also, what we're seeing downtown is a lot of revitalization, a lot of building and development right now. And I recognize, of course, that a lot of the building and development we're seeing today was planned for years ago, wasn't planned for yesterday. But we're seeing a lot of development and building right now. And we're seeing quite a bit of open streets and pedestrianization efforts and people, taking up space and, art crawls with thousands of people. And this weekend, for instance, super crawl is going on. And so that's a big and important festival as part of our downtown. So we're seeing two things happening at the same time. We're seeing a lot of challenges, a lot of tensions because of those challenges. And then we're also seeing folks who are really enjoying downtown, moving here because they like the experiences they're having here. But as some folks have said, and business owners have shared this point of view, we can't be a place that's only for events and festivals. We have to be a place where all the time things feel safe and all the time things are thriving. And that hasn't really been Hamilton for any point that I've known about it and heard from people. I think we've lots of promises of renaissances in Hamilton and people coming back, and there being all these things that are happening in the core. And I think we've tried to do that many times and tried to get out of the tougher times. And Hamilton's, I think, on the way to that, generally speaking. But it's certainly been a very long journey, and this isn't happening just in this moment. But I think that we are seeing a number of crises overlapping. We're seeing drug poisonings, we're seeing climate change impacts, we're seeing all kinds of things. And I think that those systemic overlapping crises are really having an impact on downtown Hamiltonians. And they've been talking about it for quite some time now. I do think there's a distinction to be made, though, between what people are saying and who live here and are experiencing these things, and some of the other things we're hearing from at the tax court, for instance, and
Well,
from
yeah, I wanted to question you specifically about that because I mean I'll tell you my take as someone who's not as nearly as well informed as you, but who's someone who chose to move to Hamilton a couple of years ago and chose to move to downtown Hamilton pretty much. I felt that the tax, I mean, no one has claimed, and I wouldn't claim that downtown Hamilton is perfect. However, it has struck me as being a downtown moving in the right direction over the last, decade. Started to move in the right direction, and you know, um, what we're seeing almost now is those efforts being undermined by more macro changes at other levels of government, decisions to withdraw funding for safe injection sites or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not going to let Hamilton Council off the hook entirely for things, but that was my impression, and I thought that the out of the blue unilateral kind of decision by the tax court in particular was really sort of irresponsible and unfair. I mean, shootings downtown, not good. No one's going to claim that's acceptable.
Right. Yeah.
However, just sort of say that it's simply not a safe place for people to work, particularly in somewhere which is presumably has its own security whenever it's open. Any court that I've ever been to has more protection than the store next door.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel that was kind of out of line, that decision?
Well, I think a few things happened there that weren't reported, and I wish they had been reported, to be honest with you. And I've followed up with some folks to say I think that there's worth doing a follow-up story here. The tax court had reached out actually some years ago, I would say, more than a year ago at least, to voice concerns about the fact that there had been an encampment at City Hall, and they didn't like the proximity of the encampment, and they said that some of their staff were experiencing safety issues and things like that as a result. And so this wasn't out of the blue. I think that's really important, is that although the tax court, I sort of on the way out wanted to make a point, I think, which was, the recent shootings are why we're leaving. That's not at all what happened. I certainly have email correspondence from them going back a while now.
They had actually closed before, and the previous time they specifically said it was about the homeless encampment, which creates less sympathy in my mind, certainly for their decision, because it's like, well, you may not like homeless people living nearby, but I find that less I'm less sympathetic to that as a reason to just up sticks and move somewhere else. I know that's my perspective anyway.
I mean, I'll be honest, the tax court is right at City Hall. Like, it's pretty much nearly attached to the building. It's just across a little paved area, and I'm at City Hall all the time. I live downtown. I was there when the encampment was there and living right across the road at the time. And so I think that yes, certainly it created challenges having that encampment there, but the city and the tax court and other folks around had a fair number of security people present. I can certainly also understand that employees, especially women, who may be going in and out of there when it's dark at night in the middle of winter, might not feel particularly safe at times. And that's why they have security staff there at the tax court. I would hope that if someone reached out to them to say, we need help getting to our car, we're not feeling safe right now, that they get that kind of the escort. And so I don't think that the entire reasoning for the tax court leaving that location was down to a homeless encampment and down to shootings in downtown Hamilton. And of course, again, those shootings are not a good thing. And like you said, no one's going to say they are. But tax court also is reported widely talking about reevaluating their leases, reevaluating the buildings they're in and their assets. So this is also part of a larger conversation the federal government was having about moving around and changing their location. So I'll be honest with you, I don't think they were entirely fulsome about what the reasons were why they were leaving. And I do think they were frankly angry about the situations that were occurring downtown and were lashing out on their way out the door. And I wish that had been reported, but that's okay. You can't always get every single fact in a story, but I think that's what's going on there, and people were upset, and that's why they left. But I don't think that their impression being created about downtown as a monolith is a good idea. I think that businesses who are looking to attract people to come here, people who have run festivals here, people who are developing and doing things downtown, I kind of find it, to be honest with you, a bit strange that they would be working so hard to create an image of our downtown that's mostly negative. Again, I know that there are things happening, and I started by speaking to some of the things that are happening that are having an impact on people. But we really do have to be able to live a bit in the gray and hold two thoughts in our head at the same time and not get into binary conversations. I think that those kinds of conversations aren't helping anybody. And it makes it all seem like there's just only one way to think about things. And frankly, it just like really brings the whole conversation down. I think right now, in a time when we're seeing a lot of rhetoric, I think we have to sadly keep saying things like facts are important. The evidence to support those facts is important. And during difficult times, leaders have to demonstrate compassion. And not just politicians, but anyone who's a leader, a business leader, a community leader, whoever you might be. Yep. We all have to demonstrate a bit of compassion. Again, sad to have to say that, but it seems like we really need to be drawing that line over and over again. I have been, because I think, and that's why I responded to some of the things that have been said lately, both in an op-ed I wrote and also on social media, to say, look, folks, yes, some things can be happening, but when we start going down this rabbit hole where we're pulling at theories we might have about why things are happening, we really need to ensure we center that. And there was, if you might have seen in the Spectator today, a long article that detailed from many service providers and other folks saying, you know, things we're hearing downtown, some of them are certainly true in terms of the impacts, but some of these theories about buses and other things, they're just unfounded and not true.
Yeah, I just want to address that comment, and specifically by Joe Mancinelli from LiUNA, which, again, I thought was just spectacularly unfair, irresponsible, lacking in compassion for people who are homeless in Hamilton. Yeah, well, what was your take on that?
Really, generally speaking, I think that it's a trend that's followed in the last little while from a number of community and business leaders who are saying really stigmatizing and harmful things about people who've been deprived of housing. I don't really want to repeat most of them, to be honest, because I do find them very harmful. And some of the things have suggested a really dehumanizing approach to how people understand their neighbors. And some people have called me out and said, hey, you know, you quit calling them our neighbors, or they're not our neighbors. They're our neighbors. They live near us. And this isn't where they want to live. Believe me, I've spoken to them. They don't want to live outside. They want the dignity that we all have as housed folks of having somewhere to live that's safe and healthy and affordable, but they don't have a choice. And so we don't need to punch down on the people who can't defend themselves, literally. We ought to be trying to say things like, well, what can we be doing? And I'll be honest with you, some of these leaders in our community have direct access to the levers of power, I would say, in more ways than I certainly do. As a city councillor, I'm not really hanging out with Doug Ford. And even if I supported Doug Ford, it's not really how that works. City councillors are really kept at an arm's reach from other levels of government. It's really our mayor and our government relations staff who do that work on a regular basis. And also, the people that hang out with Doug are his political donors. And we see that in picture after picture after picture on the internet, of, you know, pool parties and whatever else is going on out there, right? People are palling around. So if you've got that kind of access to Doug Ford and you're deadly serious about trying to solve this problem, you know where the money and the resources and the policies we need are at that level. You know, convince him not to be shutting down supervised consumption sites. Convince him to spend the surplus of billions of dollars not on buck a beer, but on making sure people have housing. These are the kinds of conversations that need to be happening. I don't see that advocacy happening. And if it's happening behind closed doors, it should be happening in public. If you have the space and the authority and the desire to be chirping off about your feelings about what's happening with homeless folks in a way that frankly is quite dehumanizing, you should be able to do the same thing in public and apply the same public pressure to the people that you spend your time donating to and that you're advocating to at other levels of government. This simply can't be about prosperity for some and not for everybody. If downtown, as you say, is going kind of in a certain direction, and we're seeing a lot of building here, and we're seeing sort of that thing happening in LRT and that kind of thing, which people are looking at from the perspective of prosperity, my remaining point will always be for who? And can't we make sure that everyone is lifted up if we're going to see prosperity in our community? This can't simply be about, ticket sales, and it can't simply be about realizing profits from development. It has to be about making sure everyone in our community has a place to be.
And ultimately, big cities at times of economic hardship, big cities are where people go who are in most need, who can't afford somewhere to live or whatever. That doesn't always happen. It will always happen because there are certain inherent reasons why that's the last place you can go. So to use this kind of as a stick to beat Hamilton, I find very annoying. And I wanted to come back to Joe Mancinelli just one more time, because it puts something to you that LiUNA are meant to be a trades union supporting workers, came out of the origins of socialism back in the 19th century. And here we have someone acting, it seems to me, more like a developer, more like a big business owner, complaining about people being, as he alleges, and I'm sure unfairly, being bussed in to one of his properties. Has something gone far wrong with this kind of picture of is LiUNA really a trade union anymore, or is something else going on here? This is not the first time that we've seen that they are prominent supporters of the Conservatives, of the PC, sorry. They use their muscle extensively to get what they want from the provincial government, and they've done the same with LRT, but they've done the same with other things. Something gone wrong here that should be called out?
I'll speak from my experience, and then I'll pivot a bit to talking about what I see happening here in Hamilton. I'm the former president of Guelph's largest labor union, representing 2,500 members at that time. And what I saw a lot from labor unions, and what I keep seeing now that I'm here in Hamilton from the Hamilton District Labor Council, is solidarity. And it's not solidarity with workers who are union members only. And what I hear President Anthony Marco saying it every single time he speaks in public is, this is not just about union members, this is about all workers. This is not just about workers, it's about the working class. This is not just about people who can work, it's about people with disabilities, people who are homeless, people who aren't able to do things. This is about racial justice, this is about social justice. This is what the union movement is about. And I'm so proud to see that every time he says it, I'm beam with pride, because that's what labor movements are about here, is about lifting everybody up and about being together, about solidarity. I can't really speak too specifically to what LiUNA's been up to. I haven't followed what they've been doing their entire time in Hamilton here and how that trajectory has changed. But I can tell you what one of my experiences has been, and I found kind of puzzling over the years. This year, I was asked to speak at Labor Day. And if you don't know what happens here in Hamilton, we have a pretty massive Labor Day parade. Thousands and thousands of workers and their families and other people have marched downtown. And we go from sort of in a big loop around to Bayfront Park. And we end at Bayfront Park. And there's a big picnic, essentially, right? There's a main kind of picnic, and then every union comes together and they have picnics at the park and they give speeches. And it's a really wonderful time for people to recognize and remember what kind of a town this is in terms of its labor history, but also, again, to speak broadly. All of our politicians were there, right? MP Matthew Green was there, MP Pajama was there. I spoke alongside councillors Huang and Wilson were there that day on Labor Day. And who wasn't there? LiUNA. And so I found that, and I find that continuing to be puzzling. They kind of have their own event they have for their members over somewhere else. But why not join in this celebration with everybody else? Why not get up there and stand up in front of a microphone in front of the rest of the workers in this town, talk about what your values are. Why not participate in a wholehearted way to demonstrate your solidarity with the rest of the labor unions in Hamilton? And so I've always found that really odd, and it's never really been something I've seen them do. And that, I think, says a lot about maybe how they see themselves, perhaps, outside of the labor community here. I certainly know they're welcome, but they choose to do their own thing. And so I think it's also is tricky or is kind of puzzling as well to understand the relationship between a labor union and a development wing and how that all works. And I frankly don't know how it all works. But I think those are questions people have been asking for a long time. Is how does that relationship work? And then what are your obligations? How does the structure work in an organization where you have these two competing things happening in a certain kind of way, right? And usually, in my experience anyways, as a union president, what happens is the union is supported by members' dues, right? And that's what kind of has that union going and keeps it operating. And it's a very grassroots thing in lots of ways. What happens when there are these other things happening? You have development interests or for-profit interests and these kinds of things that are kind of sometimes overlapping with union interests. And the answer is, I don't know. And I think it's why people are confused.
I just wanted to kind of chime in there. I got disconnected for a minute, so I apologize if this has already been touched upon, but bring back to the homeless issue. The HATS project, which was a bold initiative, we thought, to kind of start to address this in a very innovative and quite possibly really just a way to kind of give people dignity and a chance to get back on their feet and get plugged back into the social pipeline, if you will. As a city councilor, you're well aware that the city was trying to find a permanent spot for it, and one of those spots was opposite LiUNA, their facility. Which LiUNA fought back a visceral fight back against this because they didn't want, essentially, just didn't want homeless people near them. And again, I want to kind of bring it back to that what you just said about lifting people up, and that's what the labor movement is about. And I thought it was kind of an interesting way for them to approach that solution, where they could have built it themselves. I mean, labor could have gone in and helped build it. I thought if the best solution for homelessness is to get a job, you can't think you have all those potential union members there that you could plug into the trades job pipeline that is badly needed in this province. Maybe can comment on that and just maybe your reaction as a city councilor when that kind of came down, that there was this kind of antithetical reaction to what should have been kind of a no-brainer, like, yeah, we'll help these people out and they will become, there's a potential to strengthen their union membership, to plug people in, to all these good things that could have happened, but it was just we didn't want the appearance of homeless people near our properties.
Yeah, there's been a couple things. I know that folks representing LiUNA have said that they were trying to find solutions. They are trying to find solutions. And, that was just one they didn't think was in a good location. Like, that's what I vaguely remember them saying about this when it happened, right? And I think one of the hard things about, basically it's a sanctioned site, right? We're talking about LiUNA as a site where people could go. And I know right now, if you're not aware, there'll be a report coming out on Monday, I think, that we'll be speaking to a Wednesday meeting we'll be having about sanctioned sites. And that all came from really us having a huge amount of engagement with citizens last year, thousands of people saying, hey, have you considered doing sanctions? That's asking us to, not doing it last year though, because we wanted to put the encampment protocol in place and give that a go. We came back to that discussion this year and Councillor Huang said, hey, you know what? We're now at that point where we're starting to think about the different things we could be trying to do here. We've taken some time and try to start. It isn't really working as well as we'd hoped. And what about exploring this option? And then she put forward that motion. It got approved by all of council. And then the mayor has kind of taken it up from there and said, let's keep pursuing this. And so now we're going to get a report back from experts talking about what that looks like. It's just a complicated thing though, because generally speaking, cities running a sanctioned site without the partnership of people who have the experience running shelters would mean creating an entire infrastructure inside cities to create shelters for people. And there's something about that that's kind of antithetical to the work that cities do, and essentially because we're trying to focus on the longer term journey of getting housing. And of course, we have to have short and medium term solutions, and I've said that many times, right? But the people who are expert in this, who can deliver this quickly, who can do this work now are partners in the community. And some of those partners look like hats. Some are like the Good Shepherd. Some are like the YWCA, people who have experience doing this kind of work in the community and can assist us. And so the goal is trying to partner with people. And I think that we do need to see some innovative solutions here. I also really worry about all of that because I think that, one of the things that came out of the hats discussion that I found really hopeful was how many people said, look, this isn't the way people should be forced to live inside of this kind of fenced-in community, an open-air shelter. And people made all kinds of comparisons historically to things that have gone on like that troubled them. And what I got from that was a sense of compassion from people. They cared about making sure that their neighbors weren't living in conditions that were not good. And I worry about us going to a sanctioned sites model in a certain way because I hope that it's a temporary solution and there's an exit plan. Because if that's what we're going to be saying is a permanent answer to our housing and homelessness crisis, I'm deeply worried. And I don't have a lot of information, unfortunately, because we're waiting for that staff report on Monday, but that's kind of what's all happening there. And I do think, though, there's always going to be individuals who feel like having something near them that's different, whether that be a tall building, whether that be a sanctioned site, whether that be, encampments themselves, is not what they want to see, not what they want to have. We're going to keep being in this space for a while, and they're going to keep being uncomfortable problems in our communities. And I think that having a few other solutions at the table to see if they work, as long as we're not relying on them to provide housing, might be helpful. But I'll wait to see the report when it comes out.
I understand. Those are all valid points, and I get the city's concern about not wanting to make sure that it's a bridge, not a solution to the issue. But I do want to kind of turn it back onto LiUNA, because LiUNA's opposition wasn't the reasons that you gave were not the ones that were made public to us. It was very much that they just did not want homeless people so close. They're worried that would bring down their property value. It would disrupt their operations and what have you. What the solutions that you are the points that you just raised weren't really the ones that we heard in the public. The attitude was just like, we just don't want homeless people close to us. Put them somewhere else. And again, I kind of want to bring back to that attitude of, yeah, well, nobody wants homelessness. Like, we understand it's a social ill, but okay, we have to work to solve it. Let's do something. That doesn't seem to be there. LiUNA's quick to villainize homeless people and to say we need to get rid of them. Hamilton needs to stop babying homeless people. Okay, great, but what's the solution then? Because it's not going away. If anything, it's just getting worse. And if we're just going to say that they're just bad and we don't want them, that's not a solution in itself. And it's just that I kind of want to get back to this attitude of we're hearing is just, okay, yeah, great. Nobody wants homeless people in Hamilton, but what's the solution? And just saying get lost isn't working.
No, it's not. I think there are a couple of reasons that I hear from residents mostly, and businesses and folks like community leaders and other kinds of folks who have businesses like LiUNA downtown. And they kind of point to 2 or 3 different things I think that they're talking about when they're saying the words encampment and when they're talking about homeless folks. And it always falls with the kind of talking about public safety and criminal issues, talking about drug use, and people's frustrations about wanting a solution now. When something takes decades to happen, you can't get a solution to the problem tomorrow. It's going to take a while to untangle that knot. And I think that generally speaking, people don't have a lot of patience and they really want to see a result immediately. And there's some politicians who will walk around saying things like, I can solve this problem, and I'm a leader and change comes from me as an individual. That's not what's going on here. That's never been what's going on here. For 50 years, we've had lots of evidence to show that if you would like to address issues in your community with respect to drug use, and you are concerned about that, the best way to do that is to provide safe spaces for people to use drugs. And so we have groups who are, obviously supportive of Doug Ford and the Conservative government, who are coming in here saying the exact opposite, and in the face of experts. And we've seen op-ed after op-ed after op-ed since they announced they're closing supervised consumption sites, saying this is the wrong way to go. This exact thing happened 30, 40 years ago when they were talking about not building social housing anymore. And they did it anyway, and people propped them up anyways. And because the expert advice isn't there and people don't care, it seems that to want to follow what will work
Right.
and do it, because there's a lot of people out there who want to make this into an issue of why would the city or the province or the federal government be taking your tax dollars and using them to help people take drugs? Like, look, at people are going to take drugs, and for thousands and thousands of years have used drugs. If we want to make them environments safe for people to do so, to prevent overdose deaths and prevent them being forced to use those drugs in public, then we have to actually fund the places to do it and put policy in place to do it. And that's one thing I would say, you know, for sure, is part of this and part of the stigma.
The thing that's disappointing about this, and I was mentioning this on a podcast last week in regard to something else. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and you know, one of my earliest political memories is Margaret Thatcher being elected. Traumatic moment I still haven't recovered from, but being dragged back into that arguments, and the sort of the thousands of people who died needlessly in Britain, and I'm sure in the USA and in Canada too, because you know, at a time when the AIDS crisis was first hitting, there was unwillingness to say, well, you know, maybe let's not have drug addicts having to share needles. Let's spread the. It's not just let's be nice to people who take drugs. It's like this is something that affects us all, and can make us all safer and make but you know, it's the cheap votes, isn't it? Basically, it's you know, there are people out there who take the first thing that comes into your head is like, why are we helping drug addicts to take drugs? Fine, that's such a simple first level approach to something. For our political leaders and our leaders from other communities to feed into that, when they know better, they can look at the scientific evidence, they can look at the mountains of research that are out there. It drives me mad, and there's no question mark at the end of this at the end of this question, as often happens with me, but it really drives me nuts. I don't know. Feel free to comment.
Yeah, I do think that's a really important point, is that we do have this responsibility, I think, to some extent as leaders, to be able to focus specifically on the evidence we have access to. We don't have to focus on it. We don't have to read the reports, but they're right in front of us most of the time as politicians, and we discuss them in public meetings all the time. And so when we pretend that this issue is somehow just about the opinion of someone who may be feeling afraid and not also about the kinds of information we have at our fingertips, I think it's very disingenuous. And some people want to lean on one or the other only, you know, and yes, of course, people are afraid and have the right to be afraid. And if they don't understand something, especially, or if it's happening in their neighborhood and they don't know about the evidence, or frankly, they're just out at night and someone approaches them and it scares them. That's totally valid. And they feel afraid and worried for their safety. And then as leaders, we have to say, okay, let's hold space for that. Let's talk about how we can address that. And that's really a police matter. And I can speak to that, but that's really for the police to be addressing, and they have the legal mandate to do so. Politicians are not in charge of the police legally under the provincial acts, but great, the police can try and help you and address those issues, and let's try and find a way to connect you to them if that's who you want to talk to. But at the other side, we have to be setting policy and making decisions about how to move cities forward. We have to focus on the evidence and the facts and make sure that that's what's being presented. And that's what we're really missing in the conversation right now, is that gap. And I'd hope that community leaders would also be doing that kind of work and propping up conversations that are based on facts and evidence. What I will say though too, I think, and I understand, I get from your sense, Joel, a little bit that, you know, a dismay, right? That there's so many people who are perhaps pushing people away or saying, I don't want to have homeless people here, as if we can just snap our fingers and the problem can be solved tomorrow. But I'll be honest with you, the majority of people I speak to downtown on a regular basis, and they're across the political spectrum. When I knocked doors, we didn't knock on doors for any particular party. We knocked on every single door. And the very, very, very vast majority of people are absolutely compassionate and don't feel this way. But unfortunately, what happens is that people with influence and power in our communities usually get the loudest spotlight on them, or the brightest spotlight on them. They're usually quoted in media and other kinds of things. And sometimes the things they say are taken seriously and they can cause harm. And that's really what we're seeing happening, is I think that many, many people downtown are tired and having a hard time with some of the things they're facing every day. But most remain quite compassionate about what's happening, generally speaking. They just want to see a solution, though. That's like to your point earlier, Joel. They do just want to see a solution and find an answer. And people are problem solvers in our community, which is nice. They want to do that and they want to volunteer and they want to help, right? And it is frustrating when you have so much energy from the community saying, I want to do this. And we're saying, look, this is a systemic issue that's been building over decades. We can't solve it tomorrow. And people are saying, well, what about this thing happening over here in the city over here? Or what about what's going on over here? And it's like, well, those things can work in a limited way, but they're not going to solve the problem you're concerned about.
Well, and I guess that does strike to my point about this overarching problem, you know, because I think that the homelessness and safe consumption sites there's a Venn diagram there. There's an overlap there, and we can't have this siloed approach to it. I do find it. I guess the frustration that a lot of people get is I do believe you're right. There's a big compassion there. People don't know how to solve the issue, but they know they want to solve it. And you're right. This problem didn't happen overnight, despite what certain politicians want to say. This isn't the problem of just Trudeau or just Doug Ford, but it is happening under the watch. They have to deal with it. My concern always comes down to is the quick and easy response, the idea of, well, let's just shut down the safe consumption sites, right? And let's just villainize homelessness. It's not, you know, we've seen this before and it doesn't work, because my thoughts are the safe consumption sites, the worry is we're going to see needles and vials and drugs, paraphernalia, you know, littered across the community. And I say, okay, but that might be happening. But if you shut down the safe consumption sites, aren't we just driving all the drug use into, like right now, people worry about the tent encampments in like Gore Park and that, or other parks around the city, that they're seeing drug use in there. And I say, okay, nobody wants that, but shutting down the safe consumption site isn't going to make that problem go away. If anything, I think it's just going to exacerbate it, because,
yeah,
you know, and it's like the solutions that we're putting forward the solutions that I find that our leaders, municipal, provincial, and federal, are all kind of grabbing onto are the quick solution that it'll go away in like a month, but the problem is still going to be there, and if anything, it's going to come back 10 times worse. And that's like my concern is that, you know, people might be compassionate, say, okay, we need some tough love, and tough love doesn't work. And you're not, like, you're telling it unless you want to pay money to bus addicts to some forced treatment site, which I think will be a temporary solution at best, because they get
terrible mistake, really. Yeah.
I mean, worse than that. Yeah. I mean, it just.
But like that's the solution that we're getting into now, and I just say, like, what, this is wrong. It's not a matter of, you know, it's not a matter of we're coddling addicts. It's just, we know we've done this before. It's happened before. And it does not work. But yet we're going to spend millions of dollars of taxpayers' dollars on these things. And I like, that's, again, as Roland says, this is a question without a question mark on it. It's just more like, it's the futility that I see coming out of this debate, right? It's like, we're not giving the solutions to work a chance to work.
Now, a couple of things that you said there, I think that, you know, I don't want to repeat myself. I think that you're completely right in terms of the fact that we know what works by now. The people in the halls of power know what works, but they're also really focused on staying in politics, right? And that's a lot of what this is about. And I think they understand, generally speaking, like I do. Mind you, I wouldn't be trying to exploit this, but they understand that the majority of people don't vote, and that fractionally, when you start looking at the number of people who put a person in power, it's not that many people. And so those who are loud in certain communities and who are going to help create influence in those communities, even if those folks who are being allowed aren't doing it based on evidence, but are doing it based on cruelty or other kinds of things, they're going to respond to that because they want to remain in the chair. It's important for them to continue to have that leadership. And a lot of this comes down to, I think, a lot of mythology and around what goes on behind the scenes. And you said something I think it's really important earlier, you know, it's a sentiment I hear quite a bit is, well, this is happening on such and such a person's watch, or this is happening on so and such person's watch. And you're right. That is generally speaking the perception. But it's mostly a lot of nonsense, because at the municipal level anyways, what's happening usually requires the majority vote on council. it requires staff and experts to weigh in on what's happening. And it's usually resulting from decisions that were made in the past. And so you're kind of part of a relay race or a system of individuals who are trying to advocate for their communities. And you're caught sometimes in between a couple of different things. And so what I think some people want to do when something goes well, and there's a win, as they would put it, and I don't use that language, but people do very often, is, oh, we had a win over here, or there's a win over here. And so they want to say it was me, I did it. I was the one. I'm the one who brought in this real leadership and change. And don't want to acknowledge how it actually works, don't want to talk about the collaboration that's occurring, don't want to talk about how the systems themselves work to do these things, or that, for instance, oh, wait a minute, this thing was planned, in the previous term of council. Like, there's been a lot of discussion about right now about our housing secretariat and our housing sustainability and investment roadmap, and those are great things, but that wasn't this council's doing. We picked the baton up from the last council and we carried it forward, and I'm glad we did that. And can't we just say that instead of trying to create cults of personality around individuals about what they've done? I didn't make James Street North art crawls happen. People have said that, and I've resisted that by saying that was not me. What happened was, for decades, people have been asking us to close the streets down and make them safer in our city. When this started to happen, they said, look, this is a great example of how to do it. And I said, sure, I'll have the conversation. And it was my fellow councillors who offered up funding from the city's main collective levy to support that. It was our public works staff who figured out how to make it happen. And then from there, it's kind of grown out in even more of a grassroots way to find ways to make it vibrant and interesting. And like, that's the work you do in communities, to be collaborative. And sure, I'm not going to say it didn't take me putting the motion on the table. And it was important to have someone doing that. But that comes from working with your community and listening to them and trying to do things that are good in the community. And sure, that's helpful to have leaders who do that. But I do think there's a lot going on here in these things where we talk about what individuals are doing, how things are happening, how solutions happen. I think if we were more honest about how we actually find solutions, we'd find a lot more of them instead of waiting around for such a person to lead and bring change.
I do want to touch upon that point that you just brought up, because we wanted to try to do an episode on the safe consumption site closures. And we've reached out to a number of different sites in the 905, the Hamilton Urban Core Community Health Center is definitely one of them. Same as there was a couple in Peel and other regions that we reached out to. All of them declined to come on the podcast, and the reason that they cited was just they're trying to sort this out. And I understand their reasoning to do that. I'm not going to fault them for doing it, but as you just said, these systems are complex and they require a lot of buy-in from different community advocates. And I find, I'm using this, but there are other social problems that we've kind of tried to do stories on, and the people who we want to hear from because it's going to impact, they kind of
I understand,
chicken out. And it's like, this is your chance to kind of stand up and say, no, this works. This is the facts. And I don't know if it's a bullying kind of mentality of just they're afraid to speak, to tell their story. But I find that we take a step backwards when the people that say this is working don't step up to the microphone and share the facts on the matter. And I don't know if that's
you're right. You're right about that, Joel. It's very
or a culture of just fear.
Yep. It is actually that. Absolutely, you're right. Actually, I would say it's a culture of fear. And I think it goes back to the point I was just making, which is that when you try to create a cult of personality around yourself, where you're the one who's doing things, you're the premier of Ontario, the buck stops here, that kind of mentality, and the way you try to enforce the things that you do. Unfortunately, the ripple effect of that is that people fear you.
Right.
They're not inspired by you. They don't have hope around your leadership. They fear you. And they know that if they come out on the radio or they come out on a podcast, they come out and say something, that someone in their office will be listening to that. Someone will report that back to the person in power. And then when it comes time to make the decision to who gets to be able to have the next service, because that's what people are worried about. They're proposing these heart hubs, and I frankly think they're quite heartless, actually, in the way that they're trying to make things about forcing people into treatment and banning the use of drugs on site, which is exactly the opposite of what the evidence tells us to be doing. Regardless, the organizations here who are trying to serve communities and serve populations recognize that those communities and populations will probably still to some degree go to them for some services. Now, the suite of services used to be more robust and more impactful and frankly based on evidence, and now it's not going to be, but they still will get some services that they were always getting. And so do we want to continue to be a city or organization that serves those communities? And the answer is, of course we do. And we know that if we speak out about those situations, that we're going to be punished. And that's my worry here in all this, is the kind of politics and the nasty kind of politics we live in, is the very thin-skinned politicians that are mostly around everywhere, that if you say something negative about them, they're going to ignore you. You're going to be on the sort of the naughty list or whatever, and you're not going to get these things. And that's really what we've seen in the kinds of these cults of personalities. And I worry about that, because I think it's really causing harm in our communities. You're either with people, you're willing to go down there, you're willing to take a picture with them when they're doing something violent and awful. And if you're not, then you're not going to get the funding. And this should be, again, about the evidence. We should have arm's length decisions being made from communities. We shouldn't have this come down to political whims or people's personal feelings.
It's really, it's really politics as gangsterism, isn't it? It's like, if you're not in my gang, if you don't support my gang, come thick or thin, then you're the enemy and you're not going to get the funding. That's, we don't come out and kneecap you. We just take your funding away. But it's the same thing. It's the same argument. And it's this vindictive, again, it's so familiar to me from sort of 20, 30 years ago. This politics of our social programs will be based on how vindictive we can be to the people who need social programs. So if you take drugs, you can take drugs, but we're going to punish you for it. We're going to make you feel small about it. We're going to make you feel humiliated. If you're homeless, that's fine, but whatever services we provide, we're going to make you feel bad about those. If you're on disability, if you're unemployed, we're going to assume that you're just a sponger, and we're going to be as nasty as possible to you before we give you your money, so that you can survive barely. It's so vile, and it says such horrible things about us as a society that we're willing to vote for that and support it, and it doesn't work. Finally, we've been down this road in many countries. I know the sort of myth of Canada the good and Canada the mild has kind of been dying the last few years anyway, but my God, did we really have to plow the opposite end of the spectrum so dramatically? It's really depressing. Obviously in a ranty mood this morning, Cameron. I do apologize.
It's okay. I get it. I think you're talking about a thing that we've all been talking about for a long time here, and frankly, something liberals talked about quite a lot in 2014, 2015, which is electoral reform. And I won't go down that road too far. I think I've said it probably every time we've talked, but it's simply the only way to change politics in our country is through some type of electoral reform. Because right now, what you see happening is, and I'm not saying this from any kind of partisan perspective, to be clear, but what I think is happening is that you see two parties in power in politics, and what they do is they purposely allow the other person and the other party to go down a road that will enable their future victories. So they say, okay, this is happening here. We're not going to really stop that. We're going to speak out by saying something kind of mild. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we're going to prop them up in the next budget because we want them to succeed so they continue to look bad, so that when it comes time for the next election, we'll get elected. And then we just go back and forth between the system, which is really inherently violent. And you'll see parties calling themselves more progressive, really siding with parties that are much more conservative, just to avoid an actually progressive party or a politician from being elected, right? Just to continue to perpetuate that cycle of, well, at least I'll get my turn next time, right? And who cares what happens in the next 4 years? I'll be there in 4, 8, or 12 more years, and we'll be back in power. And it's about power. It's about being reelected. It's about the same people sitting in the same chair over and over and over again. And we need term limits, and we need electoral reform to quit this stuff from happening, right? So people aren't sat in these chairs, and good and bad people aren't sat in these chairs. There's a real, I guess it's a selfishness, but it's also an absolute ego issue, where anyone in any community thinks they're the only person that can do the job, or that there's no one else that can represent the community. There's no entry exam for politics. There are no qualifications to get into these jobs. And we all know the political parties do a terrible job of vetting candidates. And so really and truly, when you look around your community and you see people doing things, and you see people leading, and you see people caring and being compassionate and trying to do things, any one of those people with maybe a bit of help and some circumstances, some volunteers and a bit of cash to help them get the message out about who they are, could really effectively and wonderfully lead our community. When you sit in a chair for decades and decades and decades, what you're saying to everyone in your community really is, right? I think I'm the best. I think I'm the only one, and I think I'm the only one that can do this work. And I wish we lived in a place where we could have those conversations more openly. We could reform those systems so people could say, hey, bud, your 8 years are up. Your 4 years are up. Your 12 years are up. It doesn't really matter how you feel. And that's one thing about American politics I deeply appreciate, is that they're not allowing presidents to stay indefinitely, right? There's a limit for the term of a president. That person can't be there forever. And it's really widely known that's how it works. Now we have similar systems in some ways in Canada, but you know, it's great to know that is at least one real tenet everyone sticks to. I mean, for the time being, of course, in case you know, Donald Trump gets elected and tries to change that. But I think that we're really missing that fundamental reset for everybody, and that helps to perpetuate this problem over and over and over again. And the more we see people from grassroots communities rising up to be part of politics and who have spent time in their communities, know everyone, understand that everyone who lives here has the right to exist, I think the better things will be off. And I think this council, to be honest with you, in Hamilton, as much as we may just disagree and have disagreements and arguments, or we may be divisive on some subjects, the very, very vast majority of the time we do agree. And there is a group of people on this council who are trying to work together and make things happen in the majority. It's not a great big majority. It's a very conservative council in lots of ways, whether that be at the party level or just like a small C conservative. But we do see there are people doing it. And frankly, we're trying to treat one another better, generally speaking. The kinds of toxic behavior that went on at City Hall in previous years, for the most part, has gone away. You might have a couple things that are still, of course, lingering. It's a system, it's a culture. You can't get rid of that overnight, but we have far less of the kinds of conversations and bullying between individual councillors that you saw in the last term of council. This, again, still goes on, but much reduced. And I think that's good and that's positive for everybody in our community, because if we're spending all of our time arguing with one another, we're not getting the work done, and we're not trying to move these things forward. So I think that those things, oddly enough, I think do have a ripple effect. And when you don't see, you see that reflects in the community also, right? Because then they get frustrated when they see that things aren't happening and ask why we're arguing with one another all the time. So.
Well, thanks, Cameron. We've kept you beyond, as usual. It was a great conversation, and we've probably kept you longer than we should have done. But as I'm saying this, I'm thinking of 10 other things that have come up during our conversation that I think you know, not just electoral reform, but you know, the powers that councils actually have versus the powers that we think they have, versus, and so on and so forth. So we could talk all day, but we better let you go, and we really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, both of you. Happy to come back and chat about any of those subjects another day.
Fantastic.
Right. Thank you.